My daughter destroyed all her brother's stuffed animals, and it probably saved our lives. I came home from grocery shopping to find 13-year-old Adrian in the living room, surrounded by the massacred remains of every single one of 2-year-old Bert's beloved toys, cotton stuffing everywhere like snow, fabric torn to shreds scattered across the carpet. Bert was screaming so hard his face was purple while my husband stood over Adrian shouting, "She's lost her mind," pointing at the destruction with a shaking finger. I was watching TV with Bert and she just started ripping apart every toy he owns like a psycho. I dropped the grocery bags and ran to pick up Bert, who was sobbing, trying to piece together his favorite teddy bear. "Adrian, what have you done?" She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, holding something in her closed fist while my husband grabbed her hard enough to leave marks. "Bert put something shiny in his mouth," she shouted, yanking her hand away from her father. "I asked him where he got it and he pointed at his teddy bear, and when I looked inside I found these." She opened her hand to show a diamond ring, a gold necklace, and several earrings. That's when my husband's face went from angry to a flash of panic. "You had no right to destroy his toys over some costume jewelry," he quickly stammered. "They were hidden inside the teddy bear," Adrian said, looking at me instead of her father, her voice trembling but determined. "Bert could have choked to death, and I saw Dad in here last week with his sewing kit saying he was fixing rips." My husband laughed, but it sounded forced. "I was fixing them because they were falling apart, and that's just cheap jewelry I found at work during my security rounds," he said. I picked up one of the destroyed bears and found a small, neat slit in the back that had been hand-sewn shut. The jewelry inside wasn't cheap, like he said. It was real diamonds catching the light. "You hid jewelry in our baby's toys?" I asked. "I was going to pawn it," my husband said quickly, but his voice was getting higher and sweat was beading on his forehead. "Extra money for the family. You know how tight things have been." The elephant had 3 rings, the rabbit had a bracelet and earrings, the dinosaur had a watch. Every single toy had something metal inside that could have killed Bert if he swallowed it, Adrian said. "You're being dramatic," my husband responded. "I made sure the holes were secure," he then stammered. "Why not just keep them in a drawer?" I asked, staring at jewelry scattered across the floor. "Why hide them in baby toys?" My husband tried to grab the jewelry from the table, but Adrian was faster, scooping it up and backing away toward the wall. "I know why he hid them in the toys," Adrian said. "Give those to me right now," my husband suddenly shot up, moving toward her with his hands outstretched. Adrian ran behind me, pressing against my back. "This necklace has an engraving," Adrian said, her voice shaking as she held up a silver chain that caught the light. "It says, 'To Ruby, love Mom,' on the back." "Who's Ruby?" I asked innocently. My husband's face started turning, and suddenly, I felt the room tilt and had to grab the couch for support. Because Ruby Wilson was the woman from the news. She'd been found dead 3 weeks ago in the park near my husband's office, strangled with her jewelry missing. "How do you have Ruby Wilson's necklace?" I asked, afraid of his response. "I found it," my husband said quickly, his face draining of all color. "I found it at work during my security rounds and forgot to turn it in." "Ruby Wilson was killed 3 weeks ago," I said slowly, my voice barely working. "The news said her jewelry was never found." "People lose things all the time in the office complex," my husband said, but his hands were shaking now and his eyes kept darting to the door. "It must have fallen off before." "There are 12 pieces of jewelry here," Adrian shouted from behind me, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto the carpet. "Are you saying you just found all of them?" "Stop talking!" my husband shouted, lunging for Adrian with his arms outstretched. I pulled her behind me while Bert started crying harder, sensing the danger. "Did you kill Ruby?" I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. His face changed completely, all pretense dropping away. "You don't know what you're talking about," my husband said, but his voice had gone flat and cold like I'd never heard it before. "You're listening to a child who's making up stories." I grabbed both the children, backing away from him as fast as I could. My husband smiled in a way I'd never seen before, and when he spoke, his voice was different, like he'd finally stopped pretending. "You shouldn't have gone through Daddy's things, Adrian," he said. "Now I have no choice." Dan took a step toward us with his hands reaching out for Adrian, and I knew we had seconds before something terrible happened. I screamed as loud as I could while shoving both kids behind me toward the front door, but Adrian twisted away from my grip and ran toward the kitchen. Dan's head snapped toward her movement and he lunged after her while I fumbled for my phone with shaking fingers. Bert clung to my leg sobbing and making it hard to move as I punched 911 and heard the operator's voice come through. I yelled our address between gasps while watching Dan chase Adrian into the kitchen, where she grabbed the biggest knife from the wooden block on the counter. Her small hands shook as she held it out in front of her, and Dan stopped just out of reach with his palms up. "Adrian, Daddy just needs to explain something," he said in that fake, calm voice, but his eyes stayed cold and focused on the knife. I scooped up Bert and ran into the kitchen, putting myself between them while the operator kept asking questions I couldn't focus on. Dan's face twisted when he saw me still on the phone and he took another step forward. "Hang up, or things will get worse for everyone," he said. The knife shook harder in Adrian's hands as tears ran down her face, and I pressed Bert's head against my shoulder so he wouldn't see what might happen next. That's when we heard pounding on our front door and Tamara's voice yelling that she heard screaming and already called the police. Dan's face went white as the sound of sirens got louder and closer, and he backed away from us slowly with his eyes darting between the door and windows. He turned and bolted for the back door, but his foot caught on one of Bert's destroyed stuffed animals, sending him crashing into the coffee table. The jewelry scattered across the floor caught the light as he scrambled to get back up, and I pulled both kids against the wall. The front door burst open, and 2 police officers rushed in with their guns drawn, yelling for Dan to stay on the ground. He froze halfway up from the floor with his hands visible, while Adrienne dropped the knife and collapsed against me, sobbing so hard she couldn't catch her breath. The officers moved closer, keeping their guns pointed at Dan, while one of them kicked the knife away from us. "He's my husband, and he just threatened to kill us," I managed to say, while Dan glared at us with pure hatred in his eyes. They pulled his arms behind his back and snapped handcuffs on, while he started yelling that we were lying and I was crazy and trying to frame him. One officer radioed for backup and detectives, while the other kept Dan pressed against the floor despite his struggles. I showed them the jewelry scattered everywhere and tried to explain about Ruby Wilson, while Dan kept shouting over me that I was making everything up. More police cars pulled up outside with lights flashing, and soon our house filled with officers who separated us into different rooms for questioning. Adrienne wouldn't let go of my hand as a female officer gently asked her to explain what happened, and she told them everything she saw. She described finding the jewelry in Bert's toys, and how Dan had been using his sewing kit late at night, when he thought everyone was sleeping. The officer wrote everything down while Adrienne's voice got stronger, and she pointed to each destroyed toy, explaining what she found inside. Crime scene techs arrived and started photographing the torn stuffed animals and pieces of jewelry, while putting markers next to each item. Dan kept demanding a lawyer from the other room, where they had him sitting in handcuffs, still insisting this was all a misunderstanding. After what felt like hours, a tall man in a gray suit walked in and introduced himself as Detective Quentin Hale from the Homicide Division. He picked up the silver necklace with gloved hands and examined the engraving on the back before nodding to another detective. "This matches the description Ruby Wilson's mother gave us," he said quietly, while carefully placing it in an evidence bag. Dan's shouting got louder when he heard the detective's words, and 2 officers had to hold him down as he tried to stand up from the chair. Detective Hale methodically bagged each piece of jewelry, while asking me detailed questions about when I'd seen Dan with the toys. I told him about Dan's late-night repairs, and his security job at the office complex near where Ruby worked. The detective's face stayed calm, but I saw his jaw tighten when I mentioned Dan had access to the whole building during his overnight shifts. He asked if Dan had been acting strange lately, and I remembered all those overtime shifts that suddenly made sense in a horrible new way. Bert had finally stopped crying, but stayed pressed against my side while the detective examined the neat slits Dan had sewn into each toy. "These cuts are very precise," Detective Hale said, while photographing the stitching patterns on what was left of Bert's teddy bear. Dan's mother, Caroline, started calling my phone over and over, but I couldn't deal with her right now while police were still processing our home as a crime scene. The detective asked if we had somewhere safe to stay tonight, since they'd need to search the house more thoroughly for additional evidence. My neighbor Tamara grabbed my arm and told me she had a spare bedroom we could use tonight. The paramedics arrived and started checking Bert's throat with a small light while he screamed and tried to push them away. He kept reaching for the destroyed teddy bear on the floor and crying harder when they wouldn't let him have it. The paramedic felt around his neck and inside his mouth while I held him still, even though he fought against me. They said his throat looked red, but nothing was stuck, and we should watch him for any trouble breathing. Detective Hale picked up each ruined toy and found the same neat cuts Dan had sewn shut after hiding jewelry inside. He took photos of every slit and wrote notes about how the stitches matched perfectly on each one. The detective asked if we had somewhere safe to stay, since they'd be here all night collecting evidence. Tamara stepped forward and said we could stay at her place as long as we needed. I went upstairs to pack clothes for the kids while officers started searching Dan's car in the driveway. Adrienne followed me and grabbed her diary from her room along with some of Bert's clothes. We could hear the officers outside saying they found something in Dan's trunk. One of them came inside holding plastic bags with more jewelry that had been hidden under the spare tire. Detective Hale counted at least 20 more pieces, including watches and rings with different engravings. We left with Tamara while crime scene tape went up around our house. At her apartment, Adrienne sat on the couch holding Bert, who finally stopped crying but wouldn't let go of her. She sang the songs she always sang to him at bedtime while tears ran down her face. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I tried to drink the water Tamara brought me. Everything felt wrong, and I couldn't believe Dan had killed people. The phone rang, and Detective Hale said they were heading to Dan's office at the security company to search his locker and desk. He mentioned 3 other women had been murdered near that office complex in the past year. All of them had jewelry missing when their bodies were found. Each victim worked somewhere Dan would have seen them during his security rounds. I hung up and realized Dan's overtime shifts were probably when he was hunting these women. Tamara made up beds for us, but I couldn't sleep at all that night. Every few minutes, I got up to check the door locks and look out the window. My phone kept buzzing with calls from Dan's mother, Caroline, but I couldn't answer. She left message after message saying this was all a mistake and Dan would never hurt anyone. Bert woke up crying 4 times, and Adrienne had to rock him back to sleep each time. When morning came, none of us had really slept, and we just sat at Tamara's kitchen table staring at nothing. Someone knocked on the door and I jumped thinking it might be Dan somehow. Tamara looked through the peephole and said it was a woman with a badge. Isabel Santoro from Child Protective Services came in with a soft voice and kind eyes. She explained she needed to check on the children and document everything for their safety. Bert hid behind me while Isabel gently asked if she could talk to Adrian first. They sat at the table and Isabel asked about what happened yesterday with the toys. Adrian told her about finding the jewelry and how scared she was when Dan grabbed her. She mentioned seeing Dan with his sewing kit late at night when everyone was supposed to be sleeping. Isabel asked if Adrian had ever written about this, and Adrian nodded. She went to get her diary from Tamara's guest room and showed Isabel the pages. There were drawings of Dan sitting in the living room with his sewing kit and the toys spread around him. Adrian had written dates next to each drawing going back 3 months. Isabel took photos of the diary pages and thanked Adrian for being so brave. She checked Bert's throat again and wrote notes about the red marks that were still visible. Detective Hale called while Isabel was there to say the jewelry matched items from 4 different murder victims. The prosecutor was already preparing charges for multiple murders, not just Ruby Wilson. Each piece of jewelry had been reported stolen when the women were killed. Some of the victims' families had been searching for these items for over a year. He said Dan would probably never get out of prison with all this evidence against him. Just as Isabel was leaving, we heard shouting outside Tamara's door. Caroline was in the hallway demanding to see her grandchildren and banging on the door. She kept screaming that Dan was innocent and I had poisoned everyone against him. Tamara told her to leave, but Caroline just got louder and started kicking the door. Isabel called the police while Caroline yelled that she'd get custody of the kids. 2 officers arrived within minutes and found Caroline still pounding on the door. They told her she had to leave or they'd arrest her for harassment. Caroline screamed that I was keeping her grandchildren from her. And this was all lies. The officers had to physically remove her from the building while she kept shouting. Tamara deadbolted the door after they left, and we all just stood there shaking. Isabel pulled out her phone and called someone about getting us to the hospital right away for Bert's throat check. Within 20 minutes, an unmarked car arrived to take us to the emergency room, where a nurse was already waiting with paperwork started. The doctor, a young woman with gentle hands, examined Bert's throat with a light while he squirmed and cried. She said she wanted x-rays to make sure no metal pieces got stuck anywhere since he'd put that jewelry in his mouth earlier. The x-ray tech let Adrian come into the room wearing a heavy lead vest, while I waited outside watching through the window. Adrian made funny faces at Bert, sticking out her tongue and crossing her eyes to keep him still on the cold table. The machine clicked and whirred while Bert reached for his sister, and she held his tiny hand through the whole thing. The results came back clear, but the doctor wanted us to watch for any stomach pain or trouble swallowing over the next few days. My phone rang while we were leaving, and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end said he was Dan's lawyer and needed to discuss bail arrangements. He said Dan wanted to see his children and had a right to family visits before trial. I told him Dan had threatened to kill us all, and the lawyer actually said I was probably overreacting to a stressful situation. I hung up on him and blocked the number while my hands shook so bad I almost dropped the phone. That night at Tamara's apartment, the local news came on with a breaking story about a security guard arrested for multiple murders. They didn't say our names, but showed our house with yellow tape across the door and neighbors being interviewed on the lawn. Mrs. Peterson from across the street was telling reporters she always thought something was off about Dan working such strange hours. The next morning, Isabel came back with paperwork for an emergency protection order that would legally keep Dan away from us. She drove us to the courthouse where we met with a judge in his chambers instead of open court for our safety. The judge read the police report about Dan's threat and the weapons they found in his car, then signed the order immediately. He said Dan couldn't come within 500 feet of us or try to contact us in any way. Detective Hale called that afternoon asking me to come to the station to look at some photos. He spread out pictures of women on the conference room table, all young and pretty with bright smiles. One worked at the coffee shop Dan went to every morning before work, another at the gym near his office where he had a membership. He asked if I recognized any of them, and I realized I'd seen the coffee shop girl when I'd met Dan for lunch once. She'd been so friendly, remembering his usual order and asking about his family, and now she was dead. That's when it hit me that all of Dan's overtime shifts, all those late nights and weekend hours, weren't really work at all. Every time he came home exhausted saying he'd had to deal with difficult people at the office, he might have been out hunting women. All those detailed stories about problems with security cameras or dealing with trespassers were just lies to cover up where he'd really been. The reporters found Tamara's building within 2 days and started camping outside with cameras and microphones. They knocked on every door asking residents if they knew us, offering money for information about where we were staying. Tamara came back from getting groceries to find 3 reporters in the lobby trying to convince the building manager to let them upstairs. We packed our bags that night and Isabel helped us check into a hotel across town using fake names she'd arranged with the prosecutor's office. The hotel room had 2 beds and a small kitchenette, and Bert wouldn't sleep at all the first night unless Adrian was right next to him. He kept waking up crying and grabbing for her hand, and she'd sing the same lullaby over and over until he calmed down. Detective Hale called the next morning with news that made my stomach turn inside out. They'd found Dan's computer at our house and cracked the encrypted files he'd hidden behind password protection. There were hundreds of photos of women he'd been watching, some taken from far away with a zoom lens, others from security cameras at his work. The worst part was that some of these women were still alive, going about their daily lives with no idea a killer had been stalking them. Police were rushing to warn them while I ran to the hotel bathroom and threw up everything in my stomach. Adrian heard me and came to hold my hair back, and we just sat on the bathroom floor together for an hour without talking. 3 days later, Isabel arranged for Adrian to start seeing a trauma specialist who worked with children who'd witnessed violence. The therapist's office had toys and art supplies, and she told Adrian she could express herself however felt comfortable. Adrian wouldn't talk about that night at all, but she started drawing pictures instead. Dark pictures of teddy bears with monsters hiding inside them, of toys with teeth and claws, of a little boy surrounded by dangerous things. The therapist said this was normal, and might be how Adrian processed what happened for a while. A week after Dan's arrest, the prosecutor assigned to the case asked to meet with me at her office downtown. She was older, with gray hair and sharp eyes that had probably seen too much over the years. She explained Dan was facing 15 counts of murder plus attempted murder of his family, which meant life in prison without parole if convicted. Then she looked at me seriously and said the trial would be brutal, that Dan's lawyer would attack our credibility and try to make us look like liars. She asked if Adrian was strong enough to testify about finding the jewelry and what Dan said that night. I told her yes, Adrian could handle it, even though my hands were shaking under the table. 2 days later, Dan's lawyer started filing papers with the court trying to get all the jewelry thrown out as evidence. He sent copies to the prosecutor claiming I planted everything and coached Adrian to lie because I wanted a divorce and Dan's money. The prosecutor called me that afternoon and said not to worry, that this was normal defense tactics, but I could hear doubt creeping into her voice. Dan's lawyer kept filing more motions every few days, each one attacking our story from a different angle. He said the jewelry could have come from anywhere, that Dan found it during his security rounds just like he claimed. The papers accused me of being mentally unstable and said I'd turned Adrian against her father with lies. I spent hours going through old bank statements trying to prove we didn't need Dan's money, that I'd never talked about divorce before that night. 3 weeks after Dan got arrested, Detective Hale called with news that changed everything. The lab found Dan's DNA under Ruby's fingernails, skin cells that got there when she fought back against her killer. The prosecutor called it the smoking gun that would send Dan to prison for life. She said no jury would believe Dan just happened to find Ruby's jewelry after his DNA was literally under her nails. That same week, I was going through Dan's old jacket pockets before donating his clothes when my fingers touched something metal. It was a small key with a number stamped on it, the kind you get for storage units. I drove straight to the police station and gave it to Detective Hale, who ran the number through their system. The storage unit was 20 miles away, paid for in cash under a fake name, but the security footage showed Dan going in and out. Detective Hale got a warrant and called me 2 hours later with his voice shaking. Inside the unit, they found jewelry, wallets, and personal items from at least 12 different women, some dating back 5 years. There were driver's licenses, credit cards, rings, necklaces, even a few cell phones, all organized in labeled plastic bags. Each bag had a date written on it in Dan's handwriting, like he was keeping track of his kills. Detective Hale said some of these women were still listed as missing persons, their families waiting for answers. The next morning, Caroline went on the local news channel with Dan's baby pictures spread across her coffee table. She told the reporter her son was framed by his vindictive wife who wanted his life insurance money. She showed photos of Dan pushing Adrian on swings, teaching her to ride a bike, holding baby Bert in the hospital. The reporter asked about the DNA evidence, and Caroline said the police planted it, that they needed someone to blame. She looked straight at the camera and said I was destroying an innocent man's life because our marriage fell apart. The news ran the segment 3 times that day, and suddenly people online were taking sides. Some believed Caroline's story about a loving father being railroaded, while others pointed out the mountain of evidence against Dan. I started getting messages on social media calling me a liar and a gold digger trying to steal Dan's money. The prosecutor assigned us a victim advocate named Brooke, who showed up at the hotel the next day. She was older with kind eyes and immediately started helping us figure out the legal system and what would happen next. She brought coloring books for Bert and gave Adrian a journal to write down her feelings when talking was too hard. Brooke connected us with other families who'd been through similar trauma, people who understood what we were going through. She helped me fill out paperwork for victim compensation funds and explained how the trial process would work, step by step. 2 weeks later, Dan appeared in court to enter his plea with his new lawyer standing beside him. The lawyer was known for defending killers and getting them lighter sentences by claiming mental illness. Dan stood up and said not guilty to every single charge while staring right at me in the gallery. His lawyer immediately asked for a psychological evaluation, claiming Dan suffered from severe mental illness that made him unable to understand his actions. The judge looked at the evidence list, saw 15 murder charges plus attempted murder of his family, and denied bail immediately. She called Dan a clear danger to society who couldn't be trusted on the streets. The next week, my boss called me into his office and said he had to let me go. I'd missed too much work dealing with police interviews, court appearances, and keeping the kids safe from reporters. He said he understood, but the company needed someone reliable, and I couldn't guarantee when I'd be back. Brooke helped me apply for emergency victim compensation funds that would cover our hotel and food costs for a few months. She also connected me with a job placement program for crime victims, though I couldn't even think about working yet. During Adrienne's 4th therapy session, she finally broke down completely, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She told the therapist she'd noticed things for months: weird behavior from Dan, strange items in his pockets, lies about where he'd been. She said she was too scared to tell anyone because she thought she was imagining things or being paranoid. The therapist held her while she cried and kept telling her she was brave, that she'd saved Bert's life by destroying those toys. Adrienne asked if it was her fault people died because she didn't speak up sooner about her suspicions. Detective Hale called that night with updates that made me dizzy. They'd now connected Dan to 15 murders across 3 counties using the items from the storage unit. Some families had been searching for their daughters, sisters, and mothers for years without knowing what happened. Now they were finally getting answers, though not the ones they'd hoped for when their loved ones first disappeared. The detective said more victims kept being identified as they went through the evidence. 3 days later, a reporter figured out our fake names at the hotel by bribing a desk clerk. We came back from Adrienne's therapy to find him waiting in the lobby with a camera crew. He shoved a microphone in Adrienne's face, asking how it felt to have a serial killer for a father. Hotel security kicked him out, but the damage was done, our location was blown, and more reporters would come. The manager asked us to leave that night, saying other guests were complaining about the media circus in the lobby. Tamara picked us up at midnight and drove us across town to a small apartment she'd found through a friend. Nobody in that neighborhood knew who we were, and the landlord agreed to keep our real names off the lease. We moved in with just our suitcases and the few toys Tamara had bought for Bert to replace his destroyed ones. 2 weeks into living at the apartment, Dan's lawyer showed up at our door with an envelope that had my name written in Dan's handwriting. I took it with shaking hands while the lawyer stood there watching, and inside was a 3-page letter where Dan wrote that he forgave me for turning him in and destroying our family. He said he understood I was confused and scared, but that one day I'd realize what a mistake I'd made believing Adrienne's lies over my husband who loved me. The manipulation in every word made my stomach turn as I read him describing our wedding day and Bert's birth like he was some caring father instead of a killer. I ripped the letter into tiny pieces right there in front of the lawyer, then walked to the bathroom and flushed every piece down the toilet while he yelled that I was destroying legal documents. The next Monday, I tried taking Adrienne back to the school with a safety plan the counselor had created, including different drop-off times and a buddy system. But by lunch, she was in the nurse's office crying because kids kept whispering about her being the serial killer's daughter, and one boy asked if she helped hide the bodies. The principal called me to pick her up early, and for 3 more days we tried, but each time she came home with red eyes and wouldn't eat dinner. On Thursday, a group of girls cornered her in the bathroom and said she was probably just like her dad, that being crazy ran in families. I pulled her out that afternoon and started researching homeschool programs on Tamara's old laptop, filling out enrollment forms while Adrienne sat next to me drawing dark pictures. That same week, Caroline showed up at family court with a lawyer, filing emergency custody papers claiming I was an unfit mother who couldn't protect my children. She brought photos from her son's arrest and newspaper clippings, telling the judge I'd turned Dan's own children against him with my paranoid delusions. The judge read through her petition while Caroline sat there in her best dress, but when he saw the police reports about Dan's murders and Caroline's harassment at Tamara's apartment, he dismissed the case immediately. He told Caroline that Dan was facing 15 murder charges, and she needed to accept reality instead of traumatizing the children further. Caroline screamed that we'd destroyed her family, and security had to drag her out while she yelled that Dan was innocent. 3 days later during breakfast, Bert looked up from his cereal and said, "Scared," clear as day, his first word in over a month. I dropped my coffee mug and it shattered on the floor as I ran to hug him, both of us crying while Adrienne rushed over. His pediatrician examined him that afternoon and said the trauma was severe, that Bert would need years of specialized therapy to process what happened. She gave us referrals to child psychologists who dealt with family violence and said his selective mutism was his mind's way of protecting itself. The following week, Detective Hale drove me to the courthouse where I had to testify before the grand jury about finding the jewelry and Dan's threat to kill us. I sat in that wood-paneled room with 23 strangers staring at me while I described every detail of that night, from Adrienne destroying the toys to Dan's cold eyes when he said he had no choice. The prosecutor showed them photos of the jewelry and the destroyed toys, then played the 911 call where you could hear Dan threatening us in the background. 2 hours later, they indicted him on 15 counts of first-degree murder, plus 3 counts of attempted murder, for threatening to kill me, Adrienne, and Bert. When the trial date was set for 6 months away, Brooke sat me down and explained it would be a long process with motions and delays. She warned that Dan's lawyer would file appeal after appeal, that even with a conviction we could be dealing with this for years. She helped me apply for extended victim compensation, since I still couldn't work while managing the kids' therapy and court appearances. A week later, I got a call from a woman who ran a support group for families of violent crime victims, saying they'd heard about our case and wanted to invite us to their meetings. I wasn't sure at first because talking to strangers about Dan felt impossible, but Adrian overheard and said she wanted to go, that maybe other kids there would understand what it was like. We went that Tuesday night to a church basement where 15 people sat in a circle, and Adrian immediately connected with a girl whose dad had killed her mom. Meanwhile, Detective Hale called with updates from the forensics team who'd been processing evidence for weeks. They found Dan's fingerprints on jewelry from 3 victims he'd claimed he never met, women from different neighborhoods who had no connection to his work. His lawyer tried arguing Dan must have found those items during his security rounds too, but the detective said no jury would believe he just happened to find jewelry from women killed miles from his office. While organizing Dan's old papers for the lawyer, I found a folder in his filing cabinet that made my hands go numb. Inside were life insurance policies he'd taken out on me and both kids last year, each worth $500,000 with him as the sole beneficiary. Detective Hale said this proved premeditation, that Dan had been planning to kill us and make it look like an accident or murder-suicide to collect the money. The final thing that week was Adrian working with her therapist on a victim impact statement for the trial, writing down how her father had destroyed her sense of safety and trust. She practiced reading it out loud in therapy, her voice getting stronger each time she said the words about being terrified in her own home and saving her baby brother's life. 3 weeks later, Brooke called to warn me that Dan had fired his first lawyer and hired Benjamin Kim, a guy famous for getting murderers reduced sentences by attacking victims' families. Kim immediately filed papers saying Adrian was a troubled teen with a history of lying, who'd made up the whole story to get attention after her parents' divorce proceedings started. I stared at the documents claiming I'd coached her to plant evidence while Dan watched from jail, unable to defend himself against our conspiracy. The prosecutor assured me this was just a defense tactic, but warned it would get ugly fast. That same week, the support group Brooke found became our only safe space where nobody judged us for being related to a killer. Adrian connected with a 17-year-old girl named Maya, whose dad had murdered her mom 2 years ago, and they started texting constantly whenever panic attacks hit either of them. Maya taught Adrian breathing exercises while Adrian helped Maya deal with the guilt of testifying against her own father. The group leader explained that children of killers often felt responsible for not seeing the signs earlier, something both girls struggled with daily. Other families there understood why we couldn't go to the grocery store without checking over our shoulders, or why Adrian slept with a baseball bat next to her bed. 4 months after Dan's arrest, I found Bert in his room playing with a stuffed elephant for the first time since that horrible night. He'd refused to touch any toys with openings or pockets, screaming if anyone tried to give him anything that could hide objects inside. Adrian had spent weeks searching online for completely sealed toys with no zippers or Velcro, finally finding a special teddy bear made for babies that was sewn shut permanently. She gave it to Bert with tears in her eyes and he hugged it tight while whispering that this one was safe because nothing bad could fit inside. The therapist said this was huge progress since he'd been too scared to play at all for months. Detective Hale called the next morning with news that made me drop my coffee mug on the kitchen floor. 2 witnesses had come forward after seeing Dan's photo on the news, both placing him near crime scenes on nights he'd claimed to be working overtime. The first witness was a bartender who remembered Dan drinking alone at a bar 3 blocks from where victim number 7 was killed, checking his watch repeatedly until exactly 10:30 when he suddenly left. The second witness was a jogger who'd seen Dan's car parked near the park where Ruby died, engine running while he sat inside watching the walking paths. Both witnesses had security footage backing up their stories, destroying Dan's alibi that he'd been doing security rounds those nights. The prosecutor said this testimony would bury him at trial since it proved he'd been stalking victims while telling me he was earning overtime pay for our family. I finally got a job at a grocery store 20 miles from our old neighborhood, using my maiden name on the application so nobody would connect me to the news stories. The manager didn't ask about the gap in my employment history, just grateful to have someone willing to work closing shifts when nobody else wanted them. My coworkers treated me like any other new employee, complaining about customers and sharing lunch break gossip without knowing I went home to a family destroyed by murder. The steady paycheck meant I could stop relying on victim compensation funds and start rebuilding some kind of normal life. 3 days into my new job, Caroline showed up at the courthouse for a pretrial hearing, screaming that we'd destroyed her family and stolen her son. Security guards grabbed her when she lunged at me in the hallway, calling me a lying witch who'd turned her granddaughter against her own father. The judge watched security camera footage of her attack and immediately banned her from all future proceedings, warning that any violation would result in jail time. Caroline kept screaming that Dan was innocent even as officers dragged her out, yelling that we'd planted the jewelry and ruined an innocent man. The prosecutor met with Dan that afternoon to offer a deal where he'd avoid the death penalty if he confessed and revealed any other victims we didn't know about. Dan refused immediately, still claiming complete innocence despite the mountain of evidence including his DNA, fingerprints, witness testimony, and the jewelry found in our home. His new lawyer Kim argued the deal itself proved the prosecution's case was weak, though the prosecutor just shook her head at his desperation. She told me later that Dan's refusal meant he'd rather risk execution than admit what he'd done, showing the kind of cold calculation that made him so dangerous. 5 months after that terrible night, we attended a memorial service for all of Dan's victims at a local church. Other families who'd lost daughters, sisters, and mothers to Dan's violence welcomed us with open arms instead of the anger I'd expected. One mother hugged Adrienne tight, telling her she was a hero who'd stopped Dan from killing anyone else's daughter. Another family said Adrienne's courage in destroying those toys had given them closure after 2 years of not knowing who killed their loved one. People brought photos of the women Dan had murdered, beautiful faces that would never smile again because of the man I'd shared a bed with for 14 years. Adrienne stood up during the service and spoke briefly about how sorry she was that she hadn't found the jewelry sooner. Maybe she could have saved someone. The room erupted in voices telling her she'd done everything right, that she'd saved her brother and stopped a killer. After the memorial, Adrienne told her therapist she wanted to testify at Dan's trial, saying she couldn't let fear control her anymore. The therapist spent 3 sessions evaluating whether Adrienne was emotionally ready for the trauma of facing her father in court and being cross-examined by his lawyer. She finally agreed Adrienne was strong enough, promising to sit in the courtroom for support during testimony and help process everything afterward. 2 weeks before trial, Kim filed for a competency hearing, claiming Dan had developed delusions in jail and couldn't assist in his own defense. The court-appointed psychiatrist spent 8 hours evaluating Dan over 3 days, testing his memory, reasoning, and understanding of the charges. The evaluation found him completely sane and fully capable of standing trial, noting that his supposed delusions were actually calculated attempts to appear mentally ill. The psychiatrist's report stated Dan showed clear understanding of his situation and demonstrated above-average intelligence in his responses. Kim tried arguing for a second opinion, but the judge denied it, setting the trial date for 3 weeks away with no more delays. 3 weeks later, we packed everything we owned into boxes, while Bert watched cartoons on the floor of our empty apartment. The Victim Compensation Fund finally came through along with my first paycheck from the grocery store, giving us enough for a deposit on a 2-bedroom place across town where nobody knew our names. Bert ran through the new apartment, touching every wall and doorknob, his little feet making echoes in the empty rooms until we started moving furniture in. I painted his room blue with superhero stickers on the walls while Adrienne helped him arrange his new stuffed animals on shelves he could actually reach. That first night in the new place, Bert slept in his own bed without crying for the first time since everything happened. 6 months passed before the trial started, and walking into that courthouse made my legs shake so bad I had to lean on Adrienne. Dan sat at the defense table in a suit that didn't fit right anymore, his face thinner and his hair grown out past his collar. When our eyes met across the courtroom, he stared at me with that same cold look from the night he threatened to kill us, but I forced myself to stare right back until he looked away first. The prosecutor spent 3 days picking jurors, asking each one if they could be fair to a man accused of killing 15 women. Adrienne sat next to me every single day, holding my hand when they showed crime scene photos on the big screen. On the 4th day, Adrienne took the witness stand wearing the blue dress we'd bought special for court. She told the jury about finding the jewelry in Bert's toys, speaking so clear and calm that even the court reporter stopped typing to listen. The defense lawyer tried to confuse her, asking the same questions different ways, but she stuck to exactly what happened that night. When she described how Dan lunged at her and said she shouldn't have gone through Daddy's things, 2 jurors started crying. The prosecutor showed the jury each piece of jewelry, and Adrienne identified where she'd found every single one. Against his lawyer's advice, Dan insisted on testifying, claiming the police planted everything to frame him. The prosecutor destroyed him with evidence, showing security footage of him near crime scenes and pulling up his work schedule that proved he'd lied about overtime. Dan started sweating and stammering, changing his story 3 times about how Ruby's necklace ended up in Bert's teddy bear. When the prosecutor asked him to explain the DNA under Ruby's fingernails, Dan's lawyer objected so many times the judge threatened contempt charges. By the time Dan stepped down from the witness stand, even his own lawyer looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. The jury went to deliberate on a Tuesday morning, and we waited in a small room eating vending machine snacks for 3 days. Adrienne did her homework while I paced the hallway, checking my phone every 2 minutes even though the prosecutor promised to call the second they had a verdict. When the call finally came, we rushed back to the courtroom where Dan stood between 2 guards as the judge read guilty on every single count. Adrienne squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, and when I looked at her face, I saw peace there for the first time since that terrible night. 2 weeks later at sentencing, the judge gave Dan life without parole for each murder, making them run one after another so he'd never get out. The judge called him a monster who used his family's trust as cover for his crimes, saying Adrienne's courage saved countless future victims. Dan tried to say something, but the guards dragged him away while he was still talking. A month after the trial ended, we went to one last memorial service for all of Dan's victims at a church downtown. The families hugged Adrienne and thanked her for being brave enough to destroy those toys and stand up to her father. When they asked her to speak, she stood at the microphone for just a minute and said she only did what any big sister would do to protect her baby brother. The whole room stood up clapping while she walked back to her seat, her face red but smiling. 6 months after that horrible night, our new life felt almost normal. Bert laughed at cartoons again and played with his friends at daycare without being scared of grown-ups. Adrienne started an online group for kids whose parents had done terrible things, spending hours every week talking to other teenagers who understood what she'd been through. I finally slept through the night without waking up to check the locks, knowing Dan would die in prison before he could ever hurt us again. Thanks for hanging out and letting me wonder through all these details with you today. Definitely been a bit of a journey. I'll see you around next time. Subscribe for more content like this.